What a week. We'll come back to that. As some of you know, I spent much of this week in Detroit in order to tape an Eli talk. As you're thinking, as my kids said to me when they heard initially, what's an Eli talk? It's kind of like a Jewish TED talk. Or if you're my mother, you said, what's a TED talk? It's a short, personally and Jewishly, not a TED talk is not Jewishly, but an Eli talk, personally and Jewish-based talk on an idea meant to inspire and encourage its audience. Eli is an acronym, E-L-I, for engagement, literacy, and, in parentheses, Jewish, identity. A person with what Eli calls an inspired Jewish idea gives a 10 or so minute talk that is filmed before a live audience and then will be shared with the wider public after it's edited and stuff like that for the purpose of starting Jewish conversations and for teaching. These talks are the result of 3 to 4 months of writing, editing, preparation, and working with a coach on delivery, the crafting of a story, and messaging what we're doing. The speakers have applied and been selected from a pool of applicants. So the current cohort of us, the 15 of us who taped our Eli talks this week, were actually chosen from 150 applicants, which was kind of cool. And we came from across the country, we gathered in Detroit, and we presented our talks on a spectrum of Jewish topics. So while I spoke about creating new Jewish ritual for divorce, I heard fellow members of my cohort speak about incredibly diverse topics. For example, intentional Jewish parenting, having a personal relationship with God, reconsidering and rebuilding the relationship between Israeli Jews and diaspora Jews, considering Jewish text on consent in our era of Me Too and increasing awareness, and speaking out with our values to hold law enforcement officials accountable to protect citizens from police brutality. These were but a few of the 14 other talks I heard. Let me tell you that I am and I was and I am inspired. It was amazing. What an assembly of articulate, dedicated people. And know that only a few of them were like me, Jewish professionals, as it were. These are people who bring their passions to Judaism. Many of them have other day jobs. And Judaism to their passions in order to change our world. It's no coincidence, I think, that we were hosted in Detroit by a Jewish organization called Repair the World that provides volunteer service opportunities in that community, and actually Repair the World is a national organization. And to be honest, I came back, I really went to Detroit thinking that that would be my sermon, and all week thought about that. That was going to be my sermon, for I learned enough this week to give really multiple sermons. But I will speak more on the Eli talk inspirations and lessons at another time. I'll even, if you're nice or maybe not nice, bring my Eli talk to you, our wonderful community, in about 2 months when it's released. But I changed the sermon because, as you might imagine, the world, our country this week has given me a different sermon. For even while I was preparing with my cohort, trying to stay chilled out before my recording, and in between Eli sessions, wandering a bit around resurgent Detroit, which is really fascinating, noticing decrepit buildings being restored, even stumbling on a Yamasaki building that was built 2 years before this building was designed and built by Yamasaki. Serene Blatt-Dunitz is nodding her head in the background, knowing that in the back of the sanctuary. And also visiting a small downtown shul called the Downtown Synagogue, the only physical synagogue building in Detroit that is in current use, that is being revived by my friend and colleague, Rabbi Ariana Silverman. Even as all of these things caught my interest and optimism, the backdrop was the one we all saw this week, that of our country of fear and pessimism. The horrifying news from Texas, from Washington, D.C., of family separations, of children in cages, of tiny ones being pulled from their parents in the darkest of hours, of subhuman living conditions. Images and reports that brought back, has been written about so much of American history and Jewish history, the terrible sides of it. Scary images returning before our eyes, pieces for some of us of our own personal history, certainly of family history, perhaps memories of our own families, flashing back with pain. So what do we do with it? No doubt we'd all like to be awakened and told this was a bad dream and not a reality. For whatever our politics and whoever we've supported in elections, let's be clear. This is a reality of children separated from parents, even after an executive order changing that somewhat, and no articulated plans yet to reunite those families. It's a question of treatment of those crossing our borders. These are not political issues. This is a humanitarian issue. It's not to say there aren't political pieces, but that's not where I'm going tonight. Let's focus on human life, human lives. Time and again in Torah, we are told to remember those at risk in our community. The poor, the widow, and the orphan we repeatedly hear about in Torah. And they represent themselves, but all those who are in need. Those who are most vulnerable, who don't have a safety net under them. The most oft-repeated commandment in Torah is the biblical injunction. It says, you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Hence, what? Remember that. We have a responsibility to help others who are strangers, newcomers in our land. And throughout our text and tradition, teaching about justice stands aside, not against, teachings of compassion and kindness. We know this. Everyone sitting in this sanctuary knows this. Just as we know our own history. How many of us sitting here this evening, this Erev Shabbat, can recall stories of our own family members? This week, countless times I've seen in my mind's eye the face of my grandfather, Louis Morris Greene. He came here in 1901 as a tiny child, arriving on a boat with his mother and brother. Thank God they came and arrived and met my great-grandfather, his father. I have images. The thought of him being ripped from his mother's arms is beyond imagine. And this week, too, I recalled walking the streets of the Lower East Side with some of you. It happens to be where my grandfather grew up, but I was there in October with members of women of NSCI. As we walked the Lower East Side with our wonderful guide, Professor Shira Cohn, Shira pointed out to us buildings that were once of Jewish use, two in particular that were once Jewish Landsmannschaften, or mutual aid societies, created by Jewish immigrants to help members of their own communities who had come to the United States. Buildings that are now in use by other communities. For example, let me get the pronunciation right, the Kletzgerer Brotherly Aid Society building that is now a Chinese community mutual aid organization. Those sites, in their use and reuse by different populations, well, they speak powerfully to the melting pot that is our nation and the layers and generations of immigrants that have built our nation. And this week I recalled the history of Jews fleeing from Nazi Germany, who were turned away from the Golden Door, is the American dream, the American door of freedom. The passengers of the St. Louis were perhaps the most public or well-publicized example of that, but there were many. And I recall the bold efforts of Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, who pushed forward into our government the dissemination of news of Nazi atrocities when others wouldn't stand up and wouldn't speak out. So many of us here can recall those we've heard speak out in our present and our past, who spoke out for others, perhaps even for us. All these recollections and teachings of our tradition call me to remember the priorities of our nation, that nation that is a melting pot of immigrants committed to freedom, a pot that some say is currently a pot that stopped melting, with a flame we must rekindle. And these recollections call me to remember who I am and what I believe as a Jew. And so call me to give this different sermon that says each of us can act and do something. Will any one person's actions change the entire face of inhumane treatment of other people? No, not alone. But I've heard too many people say, well, I'm not going to do it because it's not going to make a difference. I'm one person. I get that at some level. It's daunting, but that isn't it. We know from Pirkei Avot, and some of us know in the popular song we've sung for many years, Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor. Lo alecha ligmor. It's not up for us to complete the work. As the words continue, neither are we free to desist from it. In other words, we're not going to finish the job, but we got to start. So what can we do? We can give tzedakah. We can give tzedakah in the form of financial contributions to aid and legal organizations, among them Hias and Kind, Kids in Need of Defense, but there are many that are helping immigrants, children, and families. We can donate food and other necessary items. In your Shabbat announcements this evening, and many of you saw it on the Facebook page this week, is actually a link to Amazon, to a list put together in conjunction with our rabbinic colleague, Rabbi Claudio Kagan in McAllen, Texas. You can go right on through Amazon and send things that will go right there, food and other needed items, diapers and things like that. We can give tzedakah. We can protest. Next Saturday, I'm told there's a rally downtown on the National Day of Action. There'll be a rally at Daly Plaza at 11 a.m., Shabbat morning. A rally to oppose family separation and call for the expedited return of the children currently in government custody. Return them to the embrace of their families. We can go protest. And we can advocate. As Hias exhorts in an email that so many of us received this yesterday, today, call your member of Congress, call your senators, and call them every day. Because as Hias said, well, if we're not sleeping at night, neither should they. And ask them to support relevant legislation. I will get the legislation information out to you. I'm not going to give you numbers at this moment, but legislation that is about keeping families together, protecting families at the border, helping separated children, and giving a fair day in court for kids. Know that every call, every letter, every email is counted when you advocate. Even if you agree with your representatives or they agree with you, however you want to look at it, if you agree or disagree, let them know what you think. They're all counted, and it matters that you tell them. There are more things that we can do for sure, but for now we must start, each of us, all of us. As I say that, we hear the words of Hillel saying, if not now, when? And if I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? And as we do, I leave you with the words of one of my Eli Talk cohort members, Rabbi Amitai Freeman. He's a conservative rabbi, a modern Orthodox rabbi in New York. This week, Amitai and I both spoke in the realm of Jewish ideas when we gave our talks, but we live, as do you, in the realm of action. And he wrote later in the week, ideas are not enough. Our tradition compels us to act. So I urge you to take action. Go to a rally, donate money, speak to an organization doing work on the ground, call your leadership, give voice to the voiceless. This is the least we can do. So on this Shabbat, in this really most difficult week, on this Shabbat as we struggle with what upsets us, what has horrified us, let us be inspired too. Inspired by people who are right now helping to make a difference with kindness, small and large acts. Inspired by those in our own lives and our own history who have acted with kindness and have stood up for the voiceless. People we knew, people we read about, people who saved our lives and our families' lives. Let us act, let us inspire others. Indeed, that is the least we can do, and we must do it. Kenya Ratzon. Shabbat Shalom.